I was at a point where every single day of my life had become the most difficult and painful day I had ever had. And I lived in full confidence that tomorrow was always going to be worse. Right? I was broke. I weighed over 300 pounds, about 350 pounds to be exact. I had no friends. I had no job. My family and I had a very difficult relationship. And all of the loving and meaningful bonds that give you the sense that life is something you want to show up and be present for had been severed. I don't know what it feels like to die, but I do know what it feels like to believe that you're dying with a life full of regret. And I don't know if death is something that people need to be afraid of, but I do know that that is worth your fear. And I collapsed. I passed out. I woke up sometime later in a puddle of vomit, in a pile of fast food garbage, surrounded by empty pill bottles. And it took me a little bit of time to really come to terms with what had just taken place, because I was a little out of it for a while. When I did realize what happened, relief is not even a word big enough to describe the feeling that I had. It was like every cell in my body was radiating immense relief.
Is something standing between you and your happiness? It was for me. I had to face my depression and the constant negative self-talk. Therapy helped me realize I deserve to be happy. That's why this podcast is called I Choose Health, because I made the choice to heal and I want to share that with you. It's Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. 60% of you who are watching this podcast are men. And brothers, it is time to take care of yourself. As a gift to you, we've partnered with BetterHelp as our sponsor to help you start your own healing journey. We all face moments when life feels overwhelming, whether it's stress, anxiety, or just feeling stuck. Talking to someone can make a real difference. And that's where our sponsor BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp offers professional online therapy that's convenient, affordable, and entirely on your schedule. You can connect with a licensed therapist by video, phone, or even chat, whatever works best for you. Let our sponsor BetterHelp support you on your journey to better mental health. You can get 10% off your first month by going to betterhelp.com/iChooseHealth. That's betterhelp.com/iChooseHealth for 10% off your first month. Take the first step toward feeling better today. All right, guys, welcome back to the I Choose Health podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Leslie. So, guys, when we think of addiction, food isn't usually the first thing that comes to mind. But what happens when something essential to survival, like eating, becomes compulsive, self-destructive, and emotionally charged? Today's guest knows this firsthand. He didn't just survive addiction, he changed the way we understand it. Through food, science, and an unrelenting drive to heal, he transformed a near-fatal moment into a global mission for change. Adam Sud, welcome to the I Choose Health podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Adam, just take us into your life in 2012. What was your day-to-day reality, and how did addiction, both to substances and food, show up in your life at that time?
In 2012, that was the end of it. That was the end stage of my substance use disorder. At that time, I had been living in full-blown addiction for probably 10 years, a minimum. And I like to say it like this, one of the important things to really recognize that when we talk about addiction, there's a lot of stories about it, about what it is. And when you sit with someone who is struggling with addiction, if you were to listen to them and you were to hear their story, what you would really come to realize is that their addiction, what they're struggling with, isn't that story that you've heard. That really their addiction, for the most part, makes complete sense. It's very reasonable to them, but it's also very confusing to them because they don't know how what was once a phenomenal solution to their life had become an overwhelming and inescapable problem. And that's where I was in 2012. I didn't get it. I had been abusing stimulants like Adderall and cocaine for 10 years. And I was at a point where every single day of my life had become the most difficult and painful day I had ever had. And I lived in full confidence that tomorrow was always going to be worse. And I was broke. I weighed over 300 pounds, about 350 pounds to be exact. I had no friends. I had no job. My family and I had a very difficult relationship, and all of the loving and meaningful bonds that give you the sense that life is something you want to show up and be present for had been severed. And the thing that I had used to give myself a sense that I had figured this thing out, Adderall, cocaine, fast food, had now become the thing that was making life impossible to be a part of. And that felt incredibly terrifying. I would use the average prescription for Adderall is about 10 milligrams for every 24 hours. I was doing about 450 milligrams a day, every single day for about 6 days straight. And I wouldn't sleep. I wouldn't eat during those 6 days. And then when I was out of my drug of choice, I would turn to fast food. And I was consuming about 5,000 to 7,000 calories of fast food a day. And I would do that for about 2 weeks. And then I would get a hold of more of my drugs, which were stimulants and opiates. I would go on a 6-day bender. Then I'd get off of that and I'd go back to the fast food. And this was this kind of vicious cycle of self-harm that I had to engage in because being present was too difficult a thing to do. And, the thing is, when you live in a reality where you wake up and you live in a body that doesn't feel like a safe, secure, or hopeful place to be, you find yourself completely severed from purpose and severed from a community of shared respect that you want to show up and be present for every single day. But when you wake up and your future doesn't feel like a safe, secure, or hopeful place to be, in fact, it feels like a very terrifying place to consider. That is the appropriate breeding ground for depression, anxiety, and suicidality, which is exactly what I was dealing with. And I was medicating that experience through drugs and food. I was divorcing myself from being present in that life by using stimulants, by using opiates, and by using fast food, to the point to where one day, like I said, every day that I was alive was the most painful day of my life. And I always lived in the confidence that tomorrow would be worse. If you live there long enough, eventually tomorrow is not a place that you want to be a part of. And that's kind of where my story goes from there.
And what you shared there, those insights show us how if you're not comfortable with yourself, how being present is a scary place to be. And, since this episode drops during Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, I want us to talk about the internal script and what beliefs or self-narratives did you think that you were repeating that made suicide feel like the only way out? And what shifted that narrative? What did choosing to live and live boldly actually require of you?
Yeah, this is actually it's interesting because when I first, obviously when I first got into recovery, talking about that day was not something I was interested in doing. But after having gone through an amazing amount of work on myself and really getting a much better understanding of what actually took place that day, I find it to be a very empowering experience to talk about. The inner dialogue that I had adopted from the world. The inner dialogue that I had was that I was a loser, that I was a burden to people. In fact, that my presence made everyone else's life worse. I had, a hypercritical household. I experienced intense bullying in high school, and then I got addicted to drugs as a result of that. And then I thought I had it figured out. Right? I thought that the drugs were the solution, and it really did for a little bit. It made me feel like I had it under control, like I could make friends, I could do all the things. And then it got worse than it was before. So I even failed at that. And I just kept getting these stories from the world that you're broken, you're not enough, you're a failure, you're a failure, Look at you. Look at what you've done with yourself. That's who you are. How could you not be the problem? Everyone else around you is doing well and you're a loser. How are you not the problem? That's the story that I kept telling myself. And I remember thinking, maybe I should ask for help. I remember thinking this, like, this is interesting because I haven't actually had this specific conversation on a podcast before. Like, I remember thinking, my dad has come to me and he said, Adam, I don't know what you're dealing with, but I have a feeling about what it might be. And, I want you to know that, I know people who've gone through similar things and blah, 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 blah. And he said these things to me and I had this, well, maybe I should tell him. But, I think this is where it gets really tricky. This is where that that end stage of depression, anxiety, where it slips into suicidal thinking, starts to really mess with you. My relationship with my dad and my relationship with my mom and my brother and my sister had gotten to a very bad place where I didn't feel like I was valuable at all to them. In fact, I felt like I was a detriment to them. And they didn't really know everything that was going on with my life. They knew to a degree, but they didn't know how bad it was. And this is where the trick comes in. I was very afraid that if I was to go to them and say, I know you think you know what's going on with me, but I'm going to tell you right now everything. I'm going to show you all of me. Well, what if I do that and they don't love me anymore? What if I do that and I actually hear them say, oh my gosh, you're worse than we thought. We don't want to tolerate you at all. The idea of having that last lingering thread of potential connection in your life severed in front of you vocally and confirm your utter worthlessness. If that was to happen, I would have been annihilated. And it was so terrifying. The prospect of experiencing that was so terrifying that I got to this place where I was up one night. I was up 5 days straight, no sleep, on thousands of milligrams of Adderall over the last 5 days. And I'm sitting there. This is August 21st, 2012. And there's a pile of pills on my coffee table, and my life at that point, I was about 2 weeks away from being evicted from my apartment. I had nowhere to go. I had no job. I was in debt. Life didn't feel like something I wanted to be a part of anymore. And I just remember I just took another pill, and then I took another. And it was like I wasn't even really thinking about it. It was almost as if like there was this part of me that was on auto drive, right? And it just kept doing this action of taking pills. And I remember the feeling that I had as the high dose took effect. And I know I'd had overdoses before, so the feeling of an overdose wasn't distinctly, unique, but this felt very unique. This was something I had not experienced before. And I felt kind of sick. And as I tried to stand up off the couch, I felt like I got stabbed in the right side with a hot knife, and my entire right side of my body cramped. And I buckled over, and as I did, my vision goes black. And I'm going to tell you in that moment, the feeling that I had, and I don't mean the physical description that I just laid out for you. I mean like the feeling that I had. I don't know what it feels like to die, but I do know what it feels like to believe that you're dying with a life full of regret. And I don't know if death is something that people need to be afraid of, but I do know that that is worth your fear. And I collapsed. I passed out. I woke up sometime later in a puddle of vomit, in a pile of fast food garbage, surrounded by empty pill bottles. And it took me a little bit of time to really come to terms with what had just taken place, because I was a little out of it for a while. And when I did realize what happened, relief is not even a word big enough to describe the feeling that I had. It was like every cell in my body was radiating immense relief. And that's the thing that was really peculiar to me. I found that to be really strange because, some time ago, I really thought what I was trying to do was trying to end my life. That's what I thought I was doing. But to have that amount of relief, to feel that relieved to be alive, man, that's only possible if there's something about yourself in your life that you love enough. There's something about yourself in your life that is still so important to you. It's certainly so important to me that I was relieved to still be a part of it, regardless of how difficult the day was going to be. And it was going to be a bad one, but man, was I glad I got to be a part of it. And that really struck a chord with me. It really had me question, what did I just try to do? Clearly, I didn't try to end my life. I don't want my life to end. What I didn't want to continue is I wanted to end my pain. I didn't know how to make sense of what I was struggling with. And I didn't know that it was okay not to be able to make sense of it. I didn't know that it was okay to want to go up to somebody and say, I don't know what's going on here. I can't figure this thing out. And I'm afraid. And usually the reason why someone doesn't feel like it's okay to do that is because what they're struggling with is cloaked in enough shame and stigma that they're concerned about revealing that to other people. What will they think of me? And so that was the moment where I finally picked up the phone and I called my family and I asked for help. It was the will to live came from the experience of being at that place of rock bottom, where I was presented front and center the reality that, hey, listen, you got two choices. You can go this way or you can go this way. This way, and it's over. And not just the hard parts, all of it. Every single thing in your life that you don't even know you might get will be gone. It will all be over. This way, and you have a potential to rediscover the experience of feeling alive, which direction you want to go. And it's now or never. And that moment of recognition of seeing how fragile life actually can be and how in a moment's time you can either end all of it or keep going, that really kind of gave me the sense of like, I'm not done yet. I don't like where I am, and I wish things were different, and I don't know how to make them different, but I'm not done yet. And so I picked up the phone.
And I think that's a perfect segue into our next question, because we know that recovery isn't done alone. And I want you to share with us the role that your family, particularly your parents, played, whether that intentionally or unintentionally, in your healing process.
Yeah. Man, it's so interesting because I had such a story about who my parents were. I had such a story about who my dad was. My dad was like my biggest adversary in life for a good part of my life growing up. Ever since I was from like middle school through college, my dad was my enemy number one. I'm really, really regretful of choosing to make him that person and not understand, who he is. But that's who I made him. And I suffered a lot as a result of that. I mean, I know he did as well. But man, I really came to know who my dad really is in recovery when the chips were down and I didn't have anywhere to go without question or judgment. I made that phone call on August 20, I guess it would have been August 22nd because it was overnight, August 22nd, 2012. And my dad was the first person I called. I didn't even think about it, which is really interesting. My dad his cell phone was the first number I called and told him I needed help. I didn't tell him what had happened, but I told him I needed help. And I was waiting for it. I was waiting for the I told you so's. I was waiting for the, we've been trying to do this for years and, you never wanted it. So why should we help you now? Like, I was waiting for that. I was waiting to be humiliated and I got none of it. In fact, what I heard were words that sounded very much like this. Adam, I love you. I love you whether you're using or you're not. I don't know how to solve this problem, but I would love it if you would come home and then your mother and I can help you figure out what's the right first step to take. What he reminded me by using that language, specifically that language, was that I'm his son first who's struggling with addiction. I am not an addict who's a problem for him, who also happens to be his son. He reminded me that I mattered and that I was actually still a meaningful part of the goings on of his life, of my mom's life, and that there's this hole in their life that I had left by struggling, and that they want nothing more than for me to come back and fill that hole and be a part of the family again. And it reminded me that I mattered. And I think that's important for people who are struggling with substance use disorder, more so, especially coming from people that we love. We want to be reminded that we've not been forgotten. We want to be reminded that we are a meaningful part of the goings on of their life. And so, I think that my dad offered me a reminder that I am not just this bucket of problems that he had to tolerate, that in fact, I was this unbelievably irreplaceable part of his life that would be. There's a quote by Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson said, "Never underestimate the hole your absence will leave." And I think that my dad kind of drove in that message. Like, I need you to understand the hole your absence will leave if I can't help you. I don't know if I could recover from it. And to be reminded that you're that important to someone, oh man, I felt immediately safe. I was terrified, but I felt safe. And so about 2 weeks later, they helped me check into treatment. And that was an ordeal. And I remember, I was so scared. Oh my God. I remember we flew out to Arizona because I went to rehab in Tucson, Arizona. And my dad and my mom flew out with me. They were determined to walk me into the doors of rehab and really be there for me. And I like had a panic attack the night before. But my dad, he got me up and he's like, let's go for a walk. We went for a walk around this golf course, and, he just kept having these like father-son moments where he was just my dad and I was just his son. And it was basically like, I don't know what's going to happen over the next, 30 days or whatever it is, but, you're safe here and you'll be fine. I've got you. And man, that just meant so much to me.
Welcome back to 52 Choices, where small weekly habits create massive momentum. This is choice number 9. Prioritize fiber and aim for 25 to 30 grams a day. Why fiber? Because it's one of the most underrated superheroes in your diet. Fiber keeps your digestion smooth, your blood sugar steady, and your hunger in check. A 2019 Lancet meta-analysis found that people who ate high-fiber diets had up to 30% lower risk of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and colorectal cancer. There are 2 kinds of fiber. Soluble fiber, found in oats, beans, and chia seeds, helps lower cholesterol and blood sugar. Insoluble fiber, found in whole grains, leafy greens, and veggies, keeps things moving through your digestive system. Not getting enough? You're not alone. 95% of Americans fall short, averaging only 15 grams a day. This week, upgrade your plate. Swap white rice for quinoa, throw some lentils in your soup, and snack on pears or almonds. Feed your gut, nourish your future, make health personal, make a choice to be you. Adam, you are a powerful speaker in terms of, not just powerful speaker, but obviously a powerful experience you've had. And the way that what you shared just brought some stuff out of me. And I've been in that place, and I've kind of referenced it a couple of times on the podcast where, my struggles with that as well, of feeling inadequate and thinking that suicide would be a good option or the only option. Yeah. And so just understanding that hole that you fill, or that hole that you create for other people. And, I think about my parents, I think about my mom, my wife, my kid, and when you're in that space, it's really hard to see that at that moment. And so that's just stating that way and just hearing it from somebody else is definitely powerful and definitely evicted this emotion out of me just now.
Well, I think about some of the things I used to say all the time to kind of excuse my way of living. I mean, I remember if you had known me 15 years ago, you're a friend of mine or a family member of mine, and you knew me and you loved me, you probably at some point would have come up to me and said, Adam, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Don't you see what's happening to you? Don't you see what's happening to your friends? And you would have said you would have asked me a very specific question. You would have asked me, why won't you stop? And I probably would have looked at you and said something really awful. I probably would have cussed at you and said, F you. You don't know how hard this is. You don't know how difficult my life is. This is how I do life. If you don't like it, I don't care. And if this costs me 10 years, I'm fine with it. You don't get it. Leave me alone. I said that all the time. If this cost me 5 years, if this cost me 10 years, I don't know how many times I used to say that. And I used to say it like it was nothing. Right? And now I look back on that language and I go, oh my gosh. I mean, I used to throw that number out there like it meant nothing. 10 years? Think about that now. If I had been successful on August 20, 2012, what would my family not give up for 10 more years with me? 10 years, no? What would they not give for 10 more days with me? That's really what kind of makes me feel unbelievably big emotions come up about who I used to be and how I used to behave. That I viewed life as such a cheap thing that I would trade 10 years for something that wasn't even necessary. Man, I know this for sure that if I can sit here right now and I can think about the people that I've loved the most that are no longer here. I don't know what I wouldn't give for 10 more minutes with them.
Yeah, that's really impactful. Just sharing it in that way is really impactful. Just breaking the time down.
Yeah.
And I just want to shift gears a little bit. Mm-hmm. And many people hit rock bottom and turn to rehab or therapy.
Sure.
For you, you turn to food as a part of your path.
Yes.
What made you explore nutrition as more than just physical fuel? And did you doubt it could actually help at first?
Man, you know what? That last question you just asked, no one has asked me that. Did I doubt it would work? Thank you so much for asking. This is great. Wow, what a great question. So, in fact, day one of rehab, I had no intention of ever considering nutrition as a method of recovery. Never. But turns out 3 days into rehab, I got diagnosed with some very serious health conditions. As I mentioned before, I was already over 300 pounds, but I had been avoiding doctors for years. 3 days in, after doing all the physical tests and everything, I found out I was type 2 diabetic. So I had an A1C of 12%, which is extremely high. I had cholesterol over 300. My blood pressure was 210 over 115. My resting heart rate was like 115. They diagnosed me with all these psychological conditions. They put me on a cabinet's worth of medication for life. And this doctor across the table was telling me the reality of my future. Here's the deal, Adam. You're diabetic. There's nothing you can do about it. Right, we're going to put you on the highest dose of oral medication, but you're likely going to go on insulin within the next year. You're at risk of losing your eyesight. You're at risk of losing limbs. You're at risk of losing your hearing. These are real things. We're going to medicate you for it. But this is potentially your future. You have extremely high cholesterol. You have advanced cardiovascular disease, likely genetic, probably runs in your family. We're going to medicate you for it, but there's a real risk of you having a cardiovascular event in the next 10 years. You are classified as class 3 obese. Likely it's a genetic thing. The statistics on weight loss aren't very good. We want you to do what you can, try to change your diet a little bit, try to eat well, try to exercise. But you're likely going to struggle with weight for a long time. But Adam, if you want your life to get better, you have to stop using drugs. And I thought to myself, that might have been the worst prescription for change I've ever heard in my life. This doctor painted a picture of a future 5-10 years from that day that I had no interest in being a part of. Far more difficult than the moment I was in. And so if that's where I'm headed, what urgency now do I have to do anything valuable for myself? If that's guaranteed the way that he described it, well, I should double down on my drug use. This isn't a life I want to be a part of. And that was the thing that really got me thinking. If I really want to do this well, if I really want to reconnect to the experience of feeling alive and being alive, I need to reverse engineer aliveness. I need to become the architect of a life that over the course of time would feel like such a safe, secure, and hopeful place to be that use would be no longer necessary. I didn't want to stop using in the hopes that life would be tolerable. I wanted to build a life that was so exciting to be a part of that I didn't need to use anymore. And so I had been inspired by a man named Rip Esselstyn, executive producer of the film called The Game Changers. He's the founder of Plant Strong, and he talked about this plant-based diet. To be fair, honestly, I didn't even know what a plant-based diet really was at the time. I didn't really want to know. My dad had dragged me to this thing. I was like, listen to this guy. I like him. And I was like, great, another person you like better than me. I was like, just a jerk about it. But man, when I was at that event with Rip, I heard, this was probably like 2 years before the checking into rehab, I heard these luminary doctors and thought leaders talk about nutrition as a vehicle that you could use to reconnect yourself to health, that it could drive you from disease to wellness. The reversal of disease was a very, very reasonable and appropriate response to the proper caloric environment. I thought to myself, hey, you know what? I don't know how to be sober, but I know how to eat, right? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to make it my mission to reverse diabetes, heart disease, erectile dysfunction, and obesity. In order to do those things, I have to not use. Great. That's a side bet, right? That's ancillary to these things. This is my mission. I wanted to create the greatest wellness I've ever had in my life while in recovery. And I figured if I could do that, if I could figure that out, that when I checked out of treatment, life would feel like something I was excited to be present for. And that's really the thing. Presence requires your sobriety. To be present requires your active participation in what's happening. You can't be divorced from presence and be participating in life, right? So that's what I was really motivated to do. And I adopted what's called a whole food plant-based diet. While I wasn't really able to do it so much in the rehab hospital, I was there for 37 days, but I moved into a sober living facility after, where I would live there for 10 months. And that's really where I adopted the plant-based diet. And within 5 months, I completely reversed the diabetes, the heart disease, the erectile dysfunction. I even lost about 150 pounds in the first year, and was able to get off of all of my psych meds. That's really, it was just, and it was just this constant exploration of discovering what would happen if I were to take charge of the environment that I lived in. And so it wasn't this plan that I had. It was kind of like this last ditch effort. Like when I found out how sick I was like, I can't be sober and sick. I don't have the capacity to do that. I have to be well in order to be sober. I can't tolerate sickness anymore.
And as you were talking about adopting that plant-based diet, I know that there's a study, I think, called the Infinite Study that you launched, and it was the first of its kind. For people that are unfamiliar with it, what did it prove, and why is that important to anyone struggling with addiction today?
Yeah, this is a great question. The Infinite Study was kind of born out of my own personal experience. So when I checked into sober living in 2012, I was there with about 10 to 13 other guys around my age. We were all seeking the same goal, which is how do we figure out how to do life without using anymore? Rehab hospitals are great. They're a way to safely divorce you from your substance and make sure that you stay away from them for 30 days and medically make sure that you're okay. But that's not really where the work is done. The work is really done afterward. You try to figure out, okay, I've been using every single day, multiple times a day for the last 10 years. So I don't know how to organize my life around anything other than using. So how do I do that? How do I rediscover how to reorganize my life around things that create change in a positive way? And so sober living is the opportunity to learn how to do that. When I checked into the sober living facility and I went into the kitchen, I looked in the pantries, I looked in the fridge, I was like, man, looks like it was stocked by nothing but teenagers who've been watching Nickelodeon commercials from the 90s. Like, this is a joke. Like, it wasn't the sober living's fault. It was literally what they do is they ask the residents, what do you want? You write out a list every week and they go and they get those things for you and they make sure you have food that you want. They're trying to empower you to not use, which I can understand that, but in my opinion, it's a poor approach to treatment. And I remember thinking, I've got to start creating the environment that encourages the life that I want. And I wrote out a list of, I think it was about 5 foods. It was oatmeal, rice, beans, fruit, and then like veggies. And I gave it to the house manager, whose last name is actually Hamburger. And I said, hey, listen, I need these foods. I'm trying to do a plant-based diet. And he said, I don't know what that is, but I'll get you this. And after living in this, what I call plant-based environment, a plant-exclusive environment, an environment that I had intentionally crafted for the purpose of caring for myself, becoming a better version of myself today than I was the day before, for giving my body the ability to demonstrate what it's capable of. After about 1 to 2 weeks, my fasting blood glucose went from 400 to 200 in 2 weeks. So it cut in half in 2 weeks. And I was like, wow, that's really remarkable. I wasn't weighing myself at the time, but my blood pressure had dropped. I was sleeping better. What I had gotten was a very specific signal. Seems like you may have figured something out here. Seems like your life has become a safer place today than it was 2 weeks ago. Seems like you should keep doing this thing and see where it takes you. What I noticed after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, when the doctor said your blood biomarkers no longer indicate that you are diabetic. You no longer have diabetes. You are no longer medicated for cardiovascular disease. You no longer have high cholesterol, high blood pressure. You no longer have erectile dysfunction. You've lost about 50 pounds at this point. What I noticed was that the trajectory of my life had started to change. When I checked into treatment and I looked down the road of my life 5 years, it wasn't somewhere I wanted to be a part of. It was a terrifying experience to actually consider it. I was afraid of that date. Didn't want anything to do with it. But after living in this environment and that trajectory of my life had shifted 5 months, 5 years from now, it seemed pretty exciting. Hey, man, if this is what the first 5 months did, I wonder what it's going to feel like in the next 5 months. I'm now resilient in my efforts to continue this path. And that's where I really started to consider, what does it mean to actually be in recovery? If I was to define recovery, it turns out there's no unified definition of it. And so when I started this study called the Infinite Study, what I wanted to investigate was the impact that dietary patterns had on addiction recovery outcomes. I saw myself enter rehab on day 1, the sickest, most disconnected from life I'd ever been. And 10 months later, leave the healthiest, most excited to be present in my life that I'd ever been. And I found out that there'd never been a single study investigating the effects of nutrition on addiction recovery outcomes. And I found that to be really frustrating because everyone else that I went through recovery with Sure, they were sober, right? They weren't using anymore, but they were on higher doses of the medications they were put on when they got in. They were on more medications. They had gained weight. Their life didn't feel any safer to them. And I was the only one in the house that had adopted a healthy dietary pattern, or plant-based dietary pattern, or plant predominant, however you want to define it. I said, this is ridiculous. This has to play some kind of role here. And so I made it my mission to go back to school, study nutrition, and then be able to come out into the world and do this infinite study. And so we had to figure out how were we going to measure recovery outcomes. Well, it turns out that when you look at the predictors for long-term recovery, and what we mean by long-term is getting from day 1 to day 365. When you look at the predictors, the biggest predicting factors are self-esteem and resilience. Okay, that's great. So we're going to measure self-esteem and resilience for individuals within a rehab hospital setting, individuals who are eating the diet that they serve, and then individuals who are eating a whole food plant-based diet. Then we're also going to measure everything else from depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive drug use, full biomarkers, everything. And we're going to run a 10-week intervention, and that's what we did. And it turns out that what we discovered is that at about week 7, there's a statistically significant increase in resilience and self-esteem in the other group, in the intervention group compared to the control group. Now that's really interesting. When we did interviews of the participants, because I really think it's important to do quantitative and qualitative, right? Like get the data and then get a story of what that data means to the person. What did it feel like for you? Why do you feel more resilient? What is it? You would hear stories like, this is my second, third, or fourth time in recovery, depending on the person, and this just feels different. I feel like for the first time, I'm caring for myself instead of just not using. That's a big thing to hear. I'm caring for myself. I remember when I was in sober living, one of the factors for changing the trajectory of my mindset was talking about my suicide survival with my house manager. I was 2 weeks into it. I didn't really want to have this conversation. And he said, "Why do you think you didn't die?" And to be fair, I was a little upset to hear that question because I kind of asked him to stop talking about it, but he just kept pushing me. And so I tried to end the conversation by just saying the first thing that came to my mind, which was, "I don't know, man. I guess my body didn't want me to die." When I heard those words, "I guess my body didn't want me to die," I kind of had to rewrite that BS story that I had been telling myself my whole life, which was my body's a mistake, that my body's my adversary. Turns out maybe the entire reason why I survived everything I'd ever gone through, why I survived the bullying, the drug use, the toxic food abuse, the self-harm, the suicide attempt, is because my body has never given up on me. Maybe my body is the greatest ally I will ever have in my entire life. Maybe my body's entire intention is to take whatever I do and keep me alive. If that's the case, what I need to do is stop trying to avoid the bad things and become a caretaker for my body. Actively pursue the things that encourage the life that I want. Turns out that when you look at recovery, you can either actively recover or you can passively recover. So passive recovery is I choose to not use today. Great. Actively recover means instead of using, I choose to organize my life around whole healthy foods. I choose to organize my life around exercise. I choose to organize my life around valuable social connection. To actively replace that use with things that you know are going to care for your life, that are going to give you a sense that tomorrow is a place you're excited to be present for. So it turns out that nutrition actually does play a role. And what we discovered, if you're going to look at anything that we've proven, when you look at the highest performing group compared to the lowest performing group, what you notice is that there's a 5x difference in fiber intake between those two groups. So it turns out, however you want to define your dietary pattern, whether you want to be omnivore, vegetarian, vegan, whatever, focusing on fiber first seems to be the most valuable thing you can do in recovery. In fact, there wasn't a single outcome that the plant-based group didn't see an improvement in, which is really wonderful to find out because there had never been a study investigating diets on recovery ever. And so now we, for the first time ever, have data that shows, turns out, high fiber diets really do benefit recovery. And for the first time ever, resilience has been linked to diet, which is a big factor because we know resilience is important to recovery.
I have two questions pertaining to that. First off, why do you think that the recovery world has largely ignored nutrition up until now, and what's missing from traditional models? And when it comes to fiber being one of the most significant things in terms of the recovery process, does that have anything to do with maybe fiber-rich foods are higher in vitamin B or vitamin B type substances? Does it have anything to do with that?
Great question. We'll start with the first one. Why do I think that the recovery world has avoided nutrition? I think that because the recovery world is modeled around the same model that we use to treat illness in the Western world, which is a disease sick care model. And so what they're doing is they're making your use the problem, right? So what I mean by that is if I was to check into treatment today and they would say, well, why are you here? I'd say, well, I'm struggling with heroin use. They would go, okay, you're a heroin addict. Your problem is heroin. So I need you to not use heroin ever again. Do you hear me? And what we're going to do is we're going to get you to identify yourself as an addict for the rest of your life. You are now a heroin addict forever. And I need you to affirm that identity to yourself every single day in groups, in therapy, whatever, so much so that you can abstain from use long enough. And our hope is that if you do that long enough, your life will get better. Here's the problem with that model. It doesn't really ask you to actively replace that use with anything. They might, but that model doesn't. When you also say to someone who's struggling with heroin that the reason why you use heroin is because you're a heroin addict, what you're telling that person is that their pain means nothing. Oh, you're an addict. That's why you use. Whatever happened to you in your life, it's a variable, but it's not really the causal factor. It's really the fact that you are born an addict, and so as soon as you use heroin, the chemical hooks in heroin took effect, and then that's why you use. That's it. The other problem with doing that is it doesn't just tell them that their pain means nothing. If you tell someone their pain means nothing, you tell them that what they love means nothing. Because why would you suffer? You would only suffer if you're being divorced from something that is important to you, that you love, that's meaningful, it's irreplaceable. Johann Hari, brilliant British journalist, wrote the book called Lost Connections, probably the best book on addiction recovery that I've ever, or on mental illness I've ever read, said that addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life has become too painful a place to be. If we want to help solve the problem with addiction, we need to help the individual understand why their use makes sense, why it's not their biology and psychology gone wrong, but really it's the appropriate response from their biology and psychology within environments gone terribly wrong. Social environments, caloric environments, physical environments that don't meet their needs. And as a result of long-term exposure to being severed from important and meaningful bonds, they are trying to pacify the passage of time through some kind of purchased relief that they're just using their way through life. And so I think that the reason why they do it is because it isn't convenient to be a treatment facility that would say, also, while you're here, we're not going to allow you to eat junk food that could be a distraction for how tough recovery is. We're not going to allow you to do this. And so it's far more attractive to the person if they can feel like they're going to be able to experience extreme comfort while also doing something difficult. That maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my feeling. In regards to the fiber, it's a really good question. So the Infinite study, we didn't look at individual mechanisms. And while we know that the gut microbiome is incredibly important in the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, right? That's 50% of dopamine and 90% of your serotonin are produced in your gut. None of those cross the blood-brain barrier, right? So those are only for the purpose of digestion. However, a healthy gut microbiome produces short-chain fatty acids that do cross the blood-brain barrier that are important for neurotransmitter production and healthy neurotransmitter production. But I'm not even sure if that's really the factor. When you look at high fiber foods, whole intact foods that are high in fiber, you're usually talking about the healthiest foods on earth. You're talking about whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, fruits, vegetables, lentils, peas. You're talking about the foods that typically encourage wellness and longevity. And I think that if you take anyone from a Western diet and you put them into that environment, and you expose them to that long enough, they're going to start to get very incredible messages from their body. Their body's going to start to encourage the wellness that it's wanted forever. the wellness that it's been trying to achieve for a long time. And they're going to get a sense that, oh my gosh, this is what life can feel like. Like I can feel healthy and sober at the same time. So I think that when you think about why fiber is so important to recovery, I think it's the reason why fiber is important, period. I think that it isn't siloed to just physical health or to muscle recovery or to these other things, but it's all encompassing. And the data on fiber intake is pretty remarkable. For every additional 10 grams of fiber from whole foods, it's a 10% reduction in all-cause mortality risk. It's a dose-dependent response, meaning the more you get, the greater your longevity outcomes. Well, that matters. That matters to people. That matters to your perception of your life. If I look down the road 20, 30, 40, 50 years from right now, I'm 43 years old. If I look at 50 years from now, I feel like I'm going to get there well based on how I live and the way that I care for myself. Do you know how much less anxiety that is for me? How encouraging and exciting it is to think that I feel really good that when I'm 90, I'm going to be active in my life. That's a remarkable thing.
And just to continue on the second part of the question, because I know that when we talk about like B vitamins as like those happy vitamins, like B6, the pyridoxine, and B12, the cyanocobalamin, are fiber-rich foods high in B vitamin typically?
Well, so B12 doesn't come from food at all. B12 comes from microorganisms in the soil. And so as a result of modern agricultural systems, we now have to triple wash everything that we eat. And so we lose those microorganisms. And so that's why B12 supplementation is so important. In fact, it's also why livestock is injected with B12 because they can't even get it from their food. So if people who say like, well, you can get B12 from meat, you're actually getting it from a supplement that was given to that animal. But yes, obviously any kind of dietary pattern that is going to have a rich micronutrient profile, which you will find in a high fiber environment, is going to benefit you across the board. Am I sure that it's a mechanistic like relationship between those vitamins and then the outcomes we saw? I'm not sure if it's a singular mechanism. I'm not a big fan of like mechanistic speculation, but here's what we do know that we saw. We took people in treatment and we fed them this way. And then as a result of feeding them this specific way, in 7 weeks, they had better outcomes than the other group. And that's important. Like if you feed people a certain way, what happens to them? Do they get better? Do they have better outcomes? Yes. Yes, they did. They were more resilient. They had more self-esteem. They had more self-compassion than the comparative group. That's really important to someone who enters into treatment feeling completely lost in their life. They don't know if they have any value that they're ever going to share within a community of shared respect. They don't know if they're ever going to feel like life is something that they want to fight for. They're not sure if they're ever going to have a sense of self that is confident and loving and caring, that they look at themselves with value and with worth. It turns out that if you were to add to the recovery environment a fiber-rich, plant-rich diet, turns out you promote those outcomes over time, and that's useful.
And are there specific foods or nutrients you consistently recommend for those rebuilding their health, physically and mentally after addiction?
This is a great question. You know, if you were to look at, in addition to just a whole food plant-based diet or a plant predominant fiber-rich diet, you know, I think that omega-3 supplementation is really important just for everyone, but certainly for individuals. And the reason for this is actually kind of interesting because when you look at the individuals who check into treatment, most people who check into treatment are come in one of two ways. They're either overfed and undernourished or underfed and undernourished. So you're going to see deficiencies in these really important micronutrients, vitamins and minerals and antioxidants that need to be restored appropriately. And sometimes it doesn't matter how well you eat. We need to sometimes add additional supplements to restore nutrient balance, and then the diet can keep it there. And so people who are checking into treatment, if you're in a facility that allows you to get a full workup, blood workup, I would absolutely advocate for getting your vitamin, your mineral levels checked. See where you are. Then depending on which deficiencies you have, ask that doctor or that dietitian, whoever you're working with, is this something that I need to be supplementing with? Can my diet alone restore this? Because, like iron deficiencies, if it's too low, even iron supplementation doesn't work. You might have to get an iron infusion to get those levels back up. So things like omega-3s, D3 deficiency can encourage and promote depressive experiences. B12 can do that as well, so B12 supplementation. And the great thing is that these are usually the most commonly available supplements. You can go to any store today and find them. You can find good quality ones. And so those B12, D3, omega-3, and DHA and EPA conversion. You want to make sure it's converted to DHA and EPA already, because there's a certain population of people who can't convert ALA to DHA and EPA. So that's a good thing to get it already converted. You can get it from algae, which is the original source, if you're on a plant-exclusive diet. If you are going to use fish oil, you really want to be clear and you really want to be sure that these are very clean sources. Unfortunately, the ocean is a toxic place. And so a lot of the times you are at risk for heavy metals like mercury. You're at risk for huge amounts of pesticides and pollutants that are present in that water that do not escape the fish. Okay, a lot of the times this is where those toxic substances are stored, is in the fats. And so that's what this is. So you got to really be careful if you're going to go that route, or you can avoid that route altogether and just do the omegas from algae.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Just go
to the original source.
Yeah. And, we're going to shift gears again. Your approach weaves together both behavioral psychology and evolutionary science. How does understanding how we're wired help people actually break free from destructive cycles?
And this is my favorite topic. Evolutionary psychology kind of saved my life. There's an amazing evolutionary psychologist named Dr. Doug Lisle. He gave a TED Talk called The Pleasure Trap, and he wrote a book by the same title. And I remember I was like a couple days into sober living, and I had a really specific experience where I came out to have breakfast the day after I asked them to get all the food that I asked for. And so I woke up and I was extremely motivated. Like I was going to do this thing. And I opened the pantry and there was the container of oats that I asked for, and they put them right next to a box of Fruity Pebbles. And Fruity Pebbles is the greatest cereal of all time. Like, period, end of story. That's the best tasting cereal in the world. And I don't know what happened next. I just know that I threw a complete fit. I yelled at someone, I threw something at somebody, and I ran out of the sober living house. And an assistant house manager had to come and get me and calm me down. And he asked me, Adam, what the heck happened in there? Because we were all eating breakfast and we saw you walk up to the pantry, open it, and then you just went berserk and ran out of the house. And his question, what happened, really got me to be curious, because I didn't understand why this whole thing couldn't be a matter of intellect and will. Why couldn't I just want to do this, know what to do, end of story? What was going on in between those two things that made this feel impossible? And that's when I discovered the TED Talk, The Pleasure Trap. And the Pleasure Trap talks about the motivational and psychological architecture inside of you that acts as a guidance system that's always trying to figure out what's the right move to make within a specific environment. Well, it turns out that we have spent 90% of our evolutionary story within a very specific environment, one of scarcity and competition, where survival resources are very difficult to get. There's not a lot of them, and it's very competitive. So we have to be very efficient. If we're going to survive, we have to know how to get the most for the least. We have to be able to figure out how to get the most amount of pleasure for the least amount of pain and the least amount of energy. When you do that in a scarce and competitive environment, you win. You win every single time. But as you start to mess with the environment, as you start to shift it away from what's appropriate to our behavior and to our nature, you start to see things happen. So it turns out we have a range of experiencing pleasure that's appropriate to our psychology, meaning that within this range, whatever we do will be good enough that we'll want to do more of it when we need it, but it will never be so good that we would risk our well-being to consistently do more of it. That's important. And in the whole natural environment, the things that you engage in are going to fall within that appropriate range. But as you start to mess with the environment, as you start to introduce what we'll call supernormal stimulus, things that give you a dopamine response that goes outside the bounds of what's appropriate to your psychology, what happens is you start to mess with your guidance system. Your dopamine receptors don't want to experience pleasure outside of this range. And so what they do is they defend themselves against this intense stimulus, and they dull the receptivity. As they dull the receptivity, now what they're doing is they're ensuring that these supernormal stimuli register pleasure within an appropriate range. But what has happened is by doing so, there's a progressive narrowing of the things in life that will give you the experience of pleasure. And pleasure is the signal. It's a signal to your psychology that what you've just done has statistically increased your likelihood of survival. It's a feeling that feels right. You want more of it. And as you experience this progressive narrowing of the things that give you pleasure, eventually you're going to be left with only a few things: hyper-palatable foods, very powerful drugs, gambling, sex, pornography. These are the only things that are going to feel good to you. And anything outside of those is going to feel wrong. And that's the pleasure trap. He describes it as if you were to go outside at night and you were to leave your porch light on, what you would notice is that they're moths and they're fluttering to the light. And the reason why they're doing this is because they're designed by nature to use brightest lights in the sky, the celestial objects, for navigation. It's how they do the thinking and the feeling required to survive. But when the brightest light in the sky is no longer the stars and the moon, when it's now this artificial light on your porch, their guidance system, their instincts for survival are completely misguided. They hit this light, they flutter down, they hit it again, they hit it again, they hit it again, and eventually they die. And you would stand there on the porch watching it, and you would go, wow, there must be something psychologically wrong with that moth. That behavior makes no sense to me. Why in the world would that moth repeatedly hit that light until it dies? And then why would every other moth that just watched this happen, why would they do the same thing? These moths are crazy. But what you have to do is pause and consider from a subjective point of view what's taking place inside this animal's mind. Based on its nature, this animal is thinking and feeling like it's doing the exact right thing for survival, when in fact it's self-destructive. By messing with its environment, by introducing a supernormal stimulus, a stimulus that was never supposed to be there, that was never supposed to exist, that animal will now always run the threat of making poor decisions, potentially fatal ones, all the while thinking and feeling like it's doing really well. That is the modern food and drug environment in a nutshell. When you watch a person compulsively eating fast food going, that makes no sense to me. Why in the world would that person do that knowing that they're getting sick by doing it? And then why would everyone else who's watched it happen, why would they all do the same thing? This makes us, these people must be crazy. They're not crazy. That is their biology and psychology doing exactly what it was designed by nature to do in an environment gone terribly wrong. Your survival instincts have been crafted to such perfection to survive a very specific environment. And it is not an environment that we're in anymore. We are designed to survive an environment we no longer live in. Your psychology was not equipped to solve that problem. So you can't rely on your willpower and your determination to outcompete thousands of years of evolutionary design. It's never going to happen. What you need to do is recognize that when you feel compelled for those junk foods, when you feel compelled for that drug use, that is the appropriate psychological response to things that should not be here. The solution isn't how do I outcompete the environment. It's how do I design an environment that looks like the life I want to live. And I design an environment that looks exactly like my goals. If I can do that and I live in that environment long enough, my dopamine receptors will regain their sensitivity. Turns out it takes about 4 months to restore 100% of your dopamine sensitivity. However, 80% of that journey occurs in the first 2 weeks. So in just 2 weeks, you get 80% of your dopamine receptivity back. You restore your internal guidance system for survival back to 80% of its capacity within just 2 weeks. Figure out, what does that environment look like? It looks like a high fiber, low saturated fat, plant predominant environment. It looks like an environment where a lot of the modern convenience stimuli are downregulated. So social media, video games, streaming services, you'll notice that people don't go to watch something that they're actually interested in. They go to find something that they're interested in, right? That's dopamine seeking. That's going to do harm to your reward system. You really want to figure out, what do I want to watch? When do I want to watch it? That's the only time I do it. You don't want to be searching streaming services trying to find something that's interesting. You want to be interested in it first, then watch it. You want to be in an environment that allows you to be outside in nature. You want to be in an environment that allows you to be connected to people who are doing life that looks enough like yours. They don't have to do it exactly like you do, but it has to be enough like the life you want so that being around them encourages the behavior you want, right? That's really how you do this thing. And that's how you understand that you're not crazy for feeling like getting off of drugs or getting away from junk food is difficult. That is the appropriate feeling. It is not your biology and psychology gone wrong. It's your biology and psychology gone right in an environment gone terribly wrong. You're not broken. You're not crazy. You make sense. Your struggle makes sense. There's a solution for it. It just isn't in the environment that you're in right now. You have to change the environment.
Well, that's really powerful. And what would you say are some of the most common mental or emotional traps that people fall into when they're trying to make a lasting health change?
Yeah, there's an ego trap that happens, which is, number one, the first thing is that they want it to happen tomorrow. This is an extraordinary amount of effort. My gosh, I've been doing this now for 3 months. My life feels better, but it's not so much better that I'm sure I want to stick with this. And then what they start to do is they create a story that this is how their life is going to feel forever. That those first 3 months of effort is how it's always going to feel. And that's a big trap. You've got to get away from that trap. You have to say, look, what I'm interested in doing is discovering the potential that exists if I was to treat myself a very specific way. And I want to follow that trail for as far as the benefit goes. And I'm okay with being comfortable being uncomfortable, or being comfortable being uncomfortable. I'm okay with it. In fact, it's required. You have to be willing to be comfortable being uncomfortable enough times in order to get the change that you want to see. Knowing that eventually this no longer feels like a chore. Eventually you start to look forward to it. It's not going to be in the first 90 days. Might not even be in the first 6 months. It's likely going to happen after month 9. It's usually what they say is 90 days to build a habit, 9 months to build a lifestyle. That's about where the data lives. And so you have to be willing to make that journey. You have to say to yourself, for nothing or no one am I stepping over this line. And the other thing is, stop comparing your chapter 1 to everyone else's chapter 12. Man, it is, you are not on anyone else's timeline. This isn't a race for you. If you don't get to where you want to be in 6 months, there's not someone waiting there with a stopwatch going, well, you didn't make it. You're out of the race. There's no fast pace. There's no slow pace. There's your pace. And I think that if we can occupy the mindset of an explorer, of a scientist, it's a much better way of doing this. So I'll say with a story, 1969, there was the Apollo mission to the moon. They took people and they trained them as astronauts. They put them on a ship and they launched them into space. They launched them into space and they had to navigate this ship to the moon, land on it, and then get out of the moon and get out and walk around on the moon. That's the story. And that's an extraordinarily dangerous mission. We've never done that before. So you must think, well, my gosh, they must have known what they were doing. They must have known how to get there. Why would they ever do it unless they knew how to do everything well enough? Do you know what percentage of the flight time they were on course to the moon? They were only on course 2% of the time. Now, if you were to look at that from a content standpoint alone, you go, wow, they spent 98% of the time going the wrong direction. It must have just been sheer luck that they landed on the moon. What a failure. No one should ever consider this a good job. Well, it turns out they didn't spend 98% of the time going the wrong direction. They spent 98% of the time course correcting. They spent 98% of the time figuring out how to do this well. And obviously those course corrections in the beginning were much bigger than they were at the end. But that's the journey that everyone within that first year of changing their life has to be willing to do. You have to be excited to make course corrections. You have to be excited to figure out whether you're going the right direction or going the wrong direction. And that means building a system that guides you forward. So you can say, you know what? I really want to do well. Is the system I'm using helping me get there effectively? If it is, great. If it's not, adjust the system. Remove your identity from what you do until what you do becomes who you are, right? When you get there, then you are the person who did the thing. Then it is who you are. But as you're figuring it out, I'm a person figuring this thing out. It's not me yet. I'm excited to get there. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that's a really interesting contrast to highlight, because I'm even thinking about my clients, where the clients that are the most successful with my programs are the clients who are typically ready and excited about change versus the ones who are only passively excited about change.
Yes. And there's an interesting thing. So I've been able to, work with a lot of people. One of the leading experts in helping people reverse insulin resistance or reverse diabetes. And I've worked with thousands of people, helped thousands of people reverse diabetes. And it's very clear that when you start working with a client, and you'll probably notice that there's 2 personalities, right? There's what I call a soldier personality, who's like, I just need a mission to run. Give me the mission, let me run it, I'll report back to you. And then there's the wanderer, which is like, I want to go hear what you have to say, not sure if I really want to do what you're doing yet, and then I'm going to go listen to this thing over here. I don't think either of them are wrong, but one of them works really well with coaching, and one of them is still gathering information. So you have to ask yourself, I think that in the beginning stages of wanting to change your life, you do have to be a bit of a wanderer. You have to open your eyes, your ears, and your awareness. You got to be willing to listen to things that may not be what you believe the world to be. And then when you hear something that sounds, oh, that sounds interesting. Not sure if they got it all figured out, but my goodness, that's interesting to me. I want to try that. When you decide whatever that thing is, you've got to put the blinders on. You got to close your ears, close your eyes, and you have to run that system. You have to run that system long enough to discover the value of it. Only then can you take the blinders off. And so I'm with you. Like when people are ready to explore and to move forward, they just want to run a system.
So we're going to start wrapping up. We're going to get onto the last couple of questions here. And I know that you've worked with leaders like Dr. Esselstyn, and if you could help get him on the show, that'd be great. And the Master in Diabetes team. What's one principle or practice from your mentors that you still carry into your work today? And also take this opportunity to speak extensively on your journey with diabetes and what you discovered about the illness and how people suffering from it can overcome it.
Yeah, when you really look into insulin resistance research, there's a big misconception in the world of diabetes. Most people think that it's caused by too much carbohydrate. Right? They think carbohydrates cause diabetes. And the reason why they believe that is because when you are diabetic, it's very difficult to metabolize carbohydrate energy. And so you'll get a signal of high blood glucose or high blood sugar. And so it's reasonable to assume that my blood sugar is high, therefore I'm eating too much sugar. This is why I'm diabetic. That's actually not what's actually happening. Turns out that insulin resistance is the excess accumulation of fatty acid energy inside of tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fatty acids. It's a problem of too much saturated fat and too much energy. So as these excess fatty acids accumulate inside the cells of your muscle and liver, they form something called a lipid droplet. This lipid droplet grows uncontrolled because unlike carbohydrate energy, which requires insulin to transport it into cells, fatty acid energy has other mechanisms that can allow it to be deposited into muscle and liver cells independent of insulin and uncontrolled. So this lipid droplet grows larger and larger over the course of time because the person's diet is too high in calories and too high in saturated fat. And at a certain point, there's just too much energy inside of the cell, and taking on any more energy will cause problems. It'll actually be damaging to the health of the cell. So inside of your cells, you have these molecules called insulin receptor substrate molecules, or IRS molecules. We can think of them like accountants because they account for how much energy is in the cell and whether there's a problem or not. They recognize a problem. So they walk up to the outside of the cell where your insulin receptors sit, and they instruct your insulin receptors to reject the action of insulin. We can't take on any new energy. We can prevent carbohydrate energy by coming in by rejecting the action of insulin. If insulin comes around trying to deliver energy, you need to tell them you're closed for business and to go somewhere else. This person's cells have now become resistant to the insulin's action of delivering energy. This is what causes diabetes. The solution to diabetes is actually rooted in a low-fat environment, reducing your total dietary fat, saturated fat, and getting into a proper energy balance where this person can lose weight, get to a healthy body mass. When you do that, because the insulin receptors are still shut off to the action of insulin, the body's now required to run on the energy inside of the cell, which is the lipid droplet. It starts to consume that lipid droplet because the dietary fat the amount of fat in the diet is so low, it's not restoring that lipid droplet. So it shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and eventually the IRS molecules have to instruct the insulin receptors to again start communicating with insulin again, allow them to deliver energy. You've restored the sensitivity of the cell to the action of insulin. That is how you reverse insulin resistance. That is how you reverse diabetes, is in a low-fat, fiber-rich, energy-appropriate dietary pattern. It's very much misconstrued within the conversation on social media. Everyone wants you to think that keto works. The reason why they want you to think keto works is because when you do ketogenic diets, you basically eat no carbohydrate, which means immediately your blood glucose goes down. But remember, the absence of blood glucose fluctuation isn't the same thing as having an insulin-sensitive body. If you take individuals who are on ketogenic diets and you feed them a banana, what do you think happens? Their blood glucose goes through the roof. The reason for this is because, well, yes, on a ketogenic diet where you have no carbohydrate energy coming in, your blood glucose barely moves during the day. You might even have a low A1C. but that lipid droplet inside the cells has actually grown potentially even larger. Those cells cannot metabolize carbohydrate energy. Your body cannot store and metabolize carbohydrate energy, which means regardless of what your blood glucose is doing, regardless of your A1C, you are still diabetic. If you cannot pass a glucose tolerance test, you are still diabetic. So in helping people reverse diabetes, what we do is we transition them to a low-fat dietary pattern, get them into a proper energy balance, help them eat more healthy foods, and they usually are able to reverse their diabetes within 3 to 9 months, depending on the individual and their age and all that. When I think about things that I've learned from mentors, I think that some of the greatest experiences that I've had is being able to lecture at events with Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, which has been a great honor of mine. The fact that I got to do that, the guy's a legend. I think that working alongside my best friend, Dr. Cyrus Kambata, who's one of the co-founders of Mastering Diabetes, one of the things I take away from him is his ravenous curiosity. To constantly be curious, to be seeking to discover what is accurate, not what you believe to be right. It's far more valuable to be accurate than wanting to be right. And I think that when I think about the people who I've been able to work with, who I respect the most, they have an unbelievable willingness to want to be accurate, to want to know rather than to just be right. And that's what I think I've taken with me from that.
And now, Adam, 10 years into sobriety, how do you care for your mental health today? What does wellness look like when crisis is over? But life is still life, of course, with its varying challenges.
Yeah. I'll have 13 years of continued sobriety in September, which is remarkable because I'm now approaching a time where I've been this version of myself longer than I was an addict, which is a kind of an interesting thing to consider. When I think about what does mental wellness look like for me today, it's the little things. It's the daily actions of demonstrating to myself that I matter, that I know who I am and what I want in my life. And those aren't just things you say, those are things that you do for yourself. It's how you treat yourself with every action that you take around your nutrition. Now, I do not have a perfect diet. I have a very good diet, but I'm not perfect. I get 90% or higher if you were to grade me every single day, 90% or higher, which means I get straight A's. It's great. That's what I want. It's in being of service to something beyond yourself every single day. It's about a belief in something greater than yourself. That doesn't have to be God, but believe me, I know what faith has done for me in recovery. And I believe that to recognize that I am not life isn't just about me. I'm not the main character in this story. That this whole thing that's going on is really, really much bigger than me. And I don't know what it is, but man, do I love being a part of it. And it's precious and it's irreplaceable and it's important. And so I want to honor that. It's in a practice of slowing down, at least for a short period of time every day, being out in nature, recognizing that I am an animal in nature longer than we have been an animal that uses laptops, that uses TV. We have been an animal of the natural world for far longer than we have been an animal of the modern world. And so I need to recognize that might be very important to my mental well-being. I need to go for a walk. If as long as it's not a torrential downpour, I need to go for a walk every single day. I need to feel the act of loving someone else every single day. Not being loved. I love that feeling, but I need to feel the act of loving someone else every day. Thankfully, I am unbelievably in love with my wife, and I get to do that every single day. And before she and I met, it was my family, it was my dad, it's my mom, it's my sister. It's calling someone every single day and just asking them how they're doing. Recognizing that you are a part of the goings on of someone else's life, and that letting them know that you're a part of it. You call them and you check in on them. That's important. You cannot underestimate the impact that not only that has on them, but what it will have on you. I'm telling you. And I think that the last thing is this is kind of an interesting one, but it's having something that you want that isn't done yet. So when we look at This is really interesting when you look at the data around soldiers, right? The ones that came home, the ones that made it home. There's interesting data that suggested that that when soldiers who left with projects at home that were unfinished, it turns out that a lot of them were more successful coming back because there was something that they really, really wanted back home. And I read that somewhere and I thought, oh my gosh, that might be important because there are battles in life, nothing like what soldiers deal with, but there are battles in life every single day. And I need something every single day that I want that's going to happen tomorrow. I need to have something that I don't have yet that's important, that I want to be a part of, that I want to be resilient in my efforts. What I say is resilience isn't just mental toughness in the face of adversity. It's the sense that there's something beyond today that feels really important and meaningful to you. Something that's so important, so irreplaceable, so exciting to you that when things get hard, and they will, you're not only able to fight, you're willing to fight so that you can see the reality of that place come to life and you can be present for it. I find that to be unbelievably important in recovery. Having something tomorrow that you want that you don't have yet.
Wow. What you just shared there just reminded me of something that happened to a very close family member of mine. Back in 2020, a brother was actually almost murdered that year. He incurred stab wounds to his throat, and his throat unfortunately was slit open. And he said the one thing that kept him going, the one thing that kept him awake and alive was saying, I have to be here for my son. I have to be here for my son. That was the driving force. That was the thing that kept him going. And so thankfully, 5 years later, we still have him here with us today.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close with these two questions. And if you could sit with your 2012 self the night before your suicide attempt, what would you say to Adam then? And then also, after everything you've been through, what does choosing health really mean to you?
Man, the funny thing is, I think about this, if I could have a conversation with myself that night, what I say. And the funny thing is it doesn't really matter what I would say. I know what my 2012 self would do. He was a jerk. He was not interested in hearing it. All I would say is, man, trust me, what you're about to go through is not going to be easy. I wish you didn't have to go through it. And I'm here to tell you, you're going to do really well. And I love you. I don't think there's anything I could have said or could have been said to him that would have prevented what happened. I just don't. But I think that if I could, I would just encourage him and let him know, hey, you're not going to know what to do tomorrow. You're not going to know what to do a week from today. It's all going to feel really terrifying. And I'm going to tell you, there are people who are going to look to you in 12 years, and they're going to look to you as an inspiration in 12 years. And I'm going to tell you, you are the hero in this story, not me. You're the one that has to get up tomorrow and figure this whole thing out. And guess what, my friend? You're going to do it. When the chips are down and the odds are stacked against you, you're the one that figured it out. That's what I would say. What does choosing health mean to me? Such a great question. I think about what life feels like today. When I get up every single day, I am surrounded by an amazing community of shared respect. I have the best friends in the world, and if I was to call them right now, they'd answer. They'd answer because they want me to be a part of their life, and I know that I want them to be a part of their life, of my life. I have a purpose that I can share within a community of shared respect that is really important to me, and it's meaningful, and I love it. Profound change isn't found in the before and after photos. Profound change is spending the majority of your life believing that you're not even worthy of loving yourself, let alone imagining anyone wanting to love you, and then one day finding yourself in the presence of the most beautiful, brilliant, passionate woman you've ever met, and listening to her say, I love you so much, I want to partner my life with you. When I think about what choosing health means to me today, I think about the fact that I can't believe that I almost ended my life right before the best part of it ever began. And for me, choosing health is an act of service to the life I never imagined I would ever have. It's an act of caregiving and caretaking for a body that carried me through all of those things to get me to a place that if on day one, if you'd asked me, what do you think recovery is going to look like? I'm like, I don't know, man. I just don't want life to suck anymore. I would have been fine with it. Just make life not suck, please. I'll be fine. I never would have imagined it would look like this. And so every single day, choosing health looks like an act of gratitude for a body and a mind that allowed me to go through all of those things and be exactly where I am today. Like, to consider anything that I do in my life that gives me health a sacrifice? Are you kidding? Man, I am choosing life choosing health is about being excited to be present in life. And whatever that takes, I'm here to do it.
And Adam, as you're going along this journey, let us know what you have coming up next, and where can we find you along your journey?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, adamsud.com. You can subscribe to my newsletter. I'm not very good at getting it out, but I'm getting better at it. So I'll be letting people know when I go speak. I'm going to be speaking on the Holistic Holiday at Sea cruise this year in Alaska, the Alaska cruise, which is an entirely plant-based cruise with speakers like Dr. Michael Greger, Robert Cheek, and there's a guy named Jonathan Otto, Columbus Batiste, and it's an amazing 7-day cruise in Alaska. I'm going to be speaking at the Thrive Alive Fest, which is like a plant-based summer camp or vegan summer camp for adults, which is going to be really cool. And then you can also find me on my Instagram account at Plant-Based Addict. I haven't posted a lot of new content there, but I'm getting ready to start doing new content pretty soon, so I'm excited about that. Yeah, I think those are the places you can find out about me.
And I just have to say, personally, this was a very powerful and impactful episode, and I'm really thankful for you just being here today, taking the time to share who you are, your experience with us. And, this is why on the I Choose Health podcast, we tell you that this choosing health is really about choosing power, possibility, and purpose. And, you never know what may be in your way within the next moment, within the next year, whatever time period we're looking at. You never know what is before you. And so just making that choice to just choose you. This is what choosing health is about. Making that choice to choose you and to choose those around you, to choose that community of love, that community of growth. And so, Adam, I just want to really thank you for sharing that with us today.
My absolute pleasure. One of the things I do at the end of every podcast, when you get into recovery, you make a lot of great friends, and unfortunately not all of them make it out with you. It's an unfortunate part of being in recovery. I do have a friend, his name was David. Now, unfortunately, he's not with us anymore, but we didn't lose him to relapse. Unfortunately, we lost him to complications and surgery. But he had the best quote I've ever heard in my life. And I tell you, there's so much about how I engage in the world because of this guy. And so I like to share this quote with people whenever I finish. He says, I remember we were talking one day, and he said, Adam, have you ever heard that quote? If you want to be happy, you should live like it's the last day of your life. And I said, yeah. He goes, do you think that's a terrible quote? I said, why do you think? I said, what? What do you mean? He goes, Adam, think about it. If you were to actually live every day like it was the last day of your life, would you do a lot of the things that are important to care for the rest of your life? Would you go to your job? Would you, do the laundry? Would you go grocery shopping? Would you do any of the things that are important for caring for yourself? I said, no, I guess I wouldn't do a lot of those things. He goes, yeah, I think if you really want to be happy, don't live like it's the last day of your life. Treat everyone you meet as if they're living the last day of their life. And I just remember, man, that just like what you would allow in other people, what permission you would give people to not see the world that you do, the same way you do, and be okay with it, because it's not important that everyone be exactly as you are or think exactly the way, but cherish the interaction that you have with that person that you may never get again. We never know, and so I love that quote.
That's a really powerful quote to close on. And if this episode has provided insight for you, has provided a path of healing for you, be sure to hit the subscribe button and then also hit the notification bell so that you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. Again, this is the I Choose Health podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Lissy. Thank you for tuning in.